Welcome to the newest episode of Beatin' and Bangin'. I'm your host, Kyle Dalton. Today's video is a little bit different than past videos for one reason. We're going to tackle a single story. Emphasis on the tackle part. As the headline reads, Chase Elliott and Dale Earnhardt Jr. don't agree on the topic of NASCAR competing against football. We learned that this week when Elliott shared his thoughts on the subject with Jeff Gluck during an interview in The Athletic, while Dale Jr. talked about the topic on the Dale Jr. download. Interestingly, the pair arrived at the issue from very different angles. But after hearing both of their cases, especially Junior's, I have to say it opened my eyes and revealed that it's not just the way the two drivers see the sport competing against football, it's actually much bigger than that. So let's start with Chase Elliott's remarks first. In case you aren't familiar, during Gluck's 12 Questions article, he always asks each driver at the end of the interview if they have a specific question they want to ask the driver scheduled for the next interview. The previous interview was Denny Hamlin, so he presented the following question to Elliott. If you were NASCAR president, what one major thing would you change? To which Elliott replied, the schedule. I look at a lot of other sports and I'm a big believer in less is more. A great example of that is the college football season. It's pretty short. They play 12 games, and then if your team makes it to the playoffs, they might play for another couple of months. But they're really only playing a couple of games in those couple of months as they go through the playoff system. Being a fan of that, man, when the end of August and beginning of September rolls around, I'm really excited about the season. It really doesn't even matter what the narrative is that season. I'm just happy to have college football back. When I look at our schedule, we could really take some of that and put it in our corner as an extremely positive thing for a lot of reasons. One, you're giving the people who really make the show go on, which are the teams, a chance to have a life at home, which is going to make them a happier person when they come to the racetrack. It's going to make the fans want us to be back on the track with more excitement and more joy. And if you did it right, you could eliminate having to compete against football, because that's just not one you're ever going to win. I'm not saying run less races either. I'm just saying from a calendar year standpoint, we have a good starting point, and I would do something to end a little sooner, just so you're not competing against football. And you drive a little bit more of that, man, I'm excited this is back, or I hate that it's gone. If you hate that it's gone in September or October, you're really going to be pumped for it to be back in February. So if you saw my Wednesday video, I said with Elliott suggesting that they run a more compressed schedule, but with the same number of races, the only way to achieve that would be through adding midweek races. I think that's an option, but another one that also came to mind is they could do double headers, similar to what they did in the COVID year. Remember when Pocono had 2 races in one weekend? That's another way that they could shorten the schedule. Listening to Elliott, I took away 2 key things. First, he's suggesting that the schedule be more compressed because it would allow the drivers and teams more off time. Translation, he's focusing on work-life balance. Go check out the full interview and you can really sense how Elliott, as he's matured, has really put a priority on things that matter to him. Spending time with those close to him being near the top. But the other thing the HMS pilot clearly states as a reason for shortening the schedule is, quote, you could eliminate having to compete against football because that's just not one you're ever going to win, end quote. Which takes me to Dale Jr.'s comments on the matter this week on the Dale Jr. download. The NASCAR Hall of Famer and his crew were talking about how weather affected the race this past weekend in Michigan. Something NASCAR fans know has happened all too often in 2024. And naturally, when that happens and the race gets pushed back or postponed to the next day, the subject of race start times always comes up. Take a listen to what Earnhardt had to say about who decides the start times.
The start times are predicted by and chosen by networks. They influence that mostly. And they know what the hell they're doing. They want to put this race where they feel like it'll get the best number. That's as simple as it is. It's not a NASCAR choice.
NASCAR Senior Vice President of Broadcasting and Innovation, Brian Herbst, appeared on the Dale Jr. Download Reloaded segment this week and addressed the topic, providing specific numbers.
Discussions like this happen. There tend to be no perfect answers. We do the best we can with imperfect scenarios, balancing all the different stakeholders that are in the sport. It's the fans at the track, it's the fans that are watching at home, it's the teams, it's the drivers, it's the sponsors, it's the TV partners. So in any scheduling discussion that we have, market by market or start times itself, you're talking about 6, 7, 8 different sets of stakeholders, OEMs, sponsor partners, that we take into consideration whenever we make a call like that. If we have 50,000 people at Michigan that are there that are watching the race on site, we have 3 million people that are watching a typical NASCAR race at home. The rule of thumb that we use, for every hour that we start later, that's an extra 5% in terms of viewership. So if we start at 3 p.m. versus 1 p.m., that's about 10%. So 5% per hour, 10% for those 2 hours. So for a race that we're running at 3 p.m. that draws an average of 3 million viewers, we would expect that race to draw 2.7 million viewers if we ran it at 1 p.m., blended across different kind of averages. So you're looking at giving up about 300,000 viewers or so.
So according to Herbst, there are a variety of stakeholders, but the most important thing he said was how 300,000 viewers are lost if you move up the start time from 3 p.m. to 1 p.m. Now, let's return to what Earnhardt said on his podcast, and he mentioned how NASCAR wants to avoid going up against any show that might have a large audience, so competing against the NFL isn't viewed as a good idea. But then he said this and took a completely opposing viewpoint from Elliott.
I also think, why not go up against the NFL? I mean, it ain't about us against them. It's just like, why are we avoiding the big guy?
Because you lose viewers, don't you think? There's going to be some casual NASCAR fans who, if I have to choose.
We can't ever gain those viewers if we don't go battle.
What if they can watch both, though?
No, they can. I mean, they can this day and age. But I've always felt like, why are we running? Why are we running away from that? Why don't NASCAR to me is number one. NASCAR to me is the best thing going. NASCAR to me can start at 1 freaking o'clock if it wants to. NASCAR don't have to settle for 3 because that's a better time slot when we all know 1 o'clock is the best time slot. The NFL is sitting on 1 o'clock because it's great. NFL ain't starting at 3 because it's better. They start at 1 because that's better. Right? And so I just don't like the idea that we're settling. It feels like we settle, or it feels like we're having to maneuver because of the bigger thing in the room, right?
Like we're like the undercard.
We're on the way. Yeah, we're the under. Yes.
Yeah.
That's the vibe I get. So I think if you're gonna act like and portray and be the underdog, you'll always be the underdog, and people are gonna see you as the underdog. In my mind, and listen, this is probably why I don't need to be running this is because I'd be so hard-headed and like, no, man, I ain't moving over. This is my space, and this is where I want to be, and I'm going to put my race on at this time. And I don't care what the numbers say. I don't care what the stats say. I don't care. And my viewership number would likely be less, but I feel like over the long game, I would be better off.
As Herbst indicated, viewership would decline by 5% per hour. But Earnhardt didn't stop there, and the download conversation took an interesting turn when the crew started talking about consistent start time.
How long have we had these 3-ish o'clock starts? A long time. They've been around a while, right? And I still am not programmed. I mean, if I'm not programmed, I'm plugged into this. This is my life. And I'm not freaking programmed. Like, I'm not like, oh, yeah, man, I know when the race starts. I don't got a freaking clue. I've got to always go look on my phone or look on the NASCAR app to see what time the race is going to start because I don't know. And so maybe this is not true, but I felt like that when I was growing up, 1 o'clock was when the race started.
Now, let's break down everything that Earnhardt had to say, and let's start with his mindset about NASCAR and how it is, no doubt, number one in his mind. It's the top dog, not the underdog. I respect and can relate to that. And I have to say, in my years of covering NASCAR, I have not followed the NFL closely at all. That's because my priority is NASCAR, so I get it. Now, when you think about what Earnhardt said and compare it with what Elliott said in his interview, they're the complete opposite. Elliott doesn't think there's a chance to win when going up against football. Earnhardt acknowledges that that's the viewpoint of many fans, but he wants to change it, or at least try to change it. The million-dollar question is, can it be done? Personally, I think it can, and a consistent 1 p.m. starting time would do it. Emphasis on the consistent. I know. NASCAR said that 3 p.m. is when the most viewers are watching. Moving it up to 1 p.m. loses 10% of the viewers. Those are the facts, according to NASCAR. So let me explain my logic. And I first want to take a look at the 3 p.m. time slot. We all know the positive of starting at 3, and it's a big one, and that's more viewers, which bottom line is more dollars. Hard to argue with that. However, on the flip side, those later starts, as we saw this past weekend in Michigan, can be adversely affected by weather. It affected the viewing audience at home, which dropped from 2.11 million viewers on USA Network Sunday to 1.11 million on Monday, half the number. The crowd at the track was also dramatically smaller. For those fans at the track, for many of them, this is their one chance to see a race all year, and in many cases, they had driven hours and hundreds of miles to do so. With the postponement, they didn't get to see the full race, had a bad experience, and left with a bad taste in their mouth. Who knows, maybe that's a reason they don't come back next year. Will they tune in? Maybe, but that's not what you want. You want fans who are willing and able to attend races in person. It's an experience that watching on television doesn't even compare. And more importantly, at the track is where first-time fans become lifelong fans. As for the fans watching on TV, ask yourself this. How many times in the last few years have you tuned into a race, started watching it, but then the rains came? You switched to something else or went and did something else and never returned to the race because you knew the track didn't have lights like Michigan, and there was a good chance they wouldn't finish the race on Sunday. I'm sure there are more than a few of you who can relate to that. Again, another bad experience. So to me, at least a couple of times each year, NASCAR fans both at the track and at home are soured on the sport by the weather, and it's connected to that 3 p.m. time slot, which takes me back to the point Dell was making about NASCAR competing against football. Football has two advantages over NASCAR. All stadiums have lights, and it's a sport they can play when it's raining. So weather and darkness are not a factor for the NFL or college football. They can start whenever they want. Not true for NASCAR. So the networks pushing the NASCAR starts to the 3 p.m. slot puts the sport at a disadvantage, at least in those instances. Again, I know rain doesn't affect every race, but when it does, and if it turns away one fan, isn't that one too many? However, if you move it to 1 p.m., I think it achieves multiple things. First, weather becomes much less of a factor. That doesn't mean it won't affect it at all, but that 2 hours extra is a lot more wiggle room for NASCAR to get in a complete race. Fans at the track and those watching at home know when they tune into a race, even with weather potentially involved, there's a greater likelihood it finishes on that day. A good experience all around. But I really believe the key to moving it to 1 p.m. and making it work, which I also think it would bring on board even more fans than what are currently tuning in at 3 p.m., is this: consistency. Think about it. Earnhardt, who is one of NASCAR's biggest ambassadors, talked about how he's not programmed to know what time the races come on and has to look it up on the NASCAR app. I'm not going to lie. I'm in the same boat. I do the same thing every weekend. Here's why. Go take a look at the current NASCAR schedule for the final dozen races, and there are 5 different start times. Yeah, 5. So if you move the start time up to 1, weather is much less of an issue and fans will be more willing to tune in because they know they'll likely see a full race. And if you start all races at 1 like it was done in the past and keep it there every Sunday, fans will develop a routine and tune in every Sunday at the same time. Over time, there's no reason that consistency doesn't convert into increased viewership. At a minimum, it won't result in losing viewers. It just makes sense. Now, before we wrap up, I want to mention this. For those of you who have followed NASCAR for a few decades, this might feel like Groundhog Day. Why? Take a look at a couple of articles from 2009. First, in the Sports Media Watch article, the opening of the article reads, "In an attempt to combat declining ratings, NASCAR races will have consistent, earlier start times next season." And the article concludes with, "Fans had previously complained about the trend of NASCAR races beginning later in the day." In a conference call discussing the scheduling changes, Fox Sports chairman David Hill acknowledged that, quote, "Traditional early Sunday afternoon start times are favored by NASCAR fans who both attend races and watch on television," end quote. Additionally, research has shown NASCAR fans are entrenched in their tradition of noon to 1 p.m. starts. And listen to what Brian France had to say about that same topic in an ESPN article. "NASCAR fans have been asking for earlier and more consistent start times, and we are making this change for our fans, beginning with the Daytona 500 next February. We are revisiting our sports tradition of earlier green flags, and the added consistency will make it easier for fans to know exactly when the races are being televised. It's been done before. Why can it be done again?" All right, guys, that's a wrap on this episode. I'm curious to hear what you think about it. Do you agree with Chase Elliott or Dale Earnhardt? Can NASCAR be viewed as a top dog versus football? And if you think so, what will it take to make it happen? Will the 1 p.m. start times work, or do you still prefer the 3 p.m. time slot? Thanks as always for supporting the channel, and have a great rest of your day.